The quarterly accounting at Ashvale ran 3 days each Michaelmas, and on the second morning, Miss Cecily Marsh had come to Mr. Oldham's office for no greater purpose than to return a set of geography primers she had borrowed from the estate library shelf. The primers had been left in a stack beside the steward's writing table, and she crossed the room to replace them, and it was in the crossing that she saw the second book. It sat behind the first ledger, flush against the wall where the afternoon light did not quite reach. The cover was the same color as the other, the same dark green calfskin. But where the estate's primary accounts book was fat with the accumulation of years, this one was thinner, the pages crisp at their edges in the way of recent use. Cecily set down the primers. She was her father's daughter in this one particular thing, and she had been taught to read a balance before she could properly sew a seam. And she had learned that a second set of books kept separate from the first was not a bookkeeper's error. It was a bookkeeper's intention. She opened it to the middle and read 3 entries. That was enough. She heard Oldham's step in the corridor, that slow, deliberate tread of a man who considered himself the fixed point around which the household moved, and she closed the ledger and replaced it exactly as it had been. She was looking at the primers on the shelf, her hands folded at her waist, when he opened the door. He looked at her the way he looked at all the governess had concluded he did not consider worth his complete attention. A glance, a small adjustment of his expression that was neither welcome nor its opposite. He asked if she required something. She said she had returned the books. He nodded and turned to his desk, and she walked out of the room with her breathing very even, and the 3 entries she had read printed behind her eyes, as clearly as if she had written them herself. The entry she remembered most precisely was a payment of £42, 11 shillings to a supplier of building materials whose name appeared nowhere in the estate's visible records of any repair completed that quarter. She had been at Ashvale 8 months. She had walked every path and corridor of the house in those 8 months. She knew which rooms had been mended and which had not. No materials had been delivered. No wall had been touched. She stood in the corridor for a moment before walking to the schoolroom, her mind working through the entry with the precise unhurriedness of someone who has learned that panic is not useful and that figures do not lie. The entry had cited a supplier named Schofield and Sons of Weatherby. She had heard no name resembling it in 8 months of paying careful attention. The sum of £42, 11 shillings was not small. It was not a rounding error. It was a decision. She went back to the schoolroom and sat down across the table from Thomas, who was working his way through a Latin declension with the particular expression of a boy who understood perfectly and found the task beneath his dignity, and she opened the geography primer and waited for her pulse to settle. Ashvale House sat in the shallow valley below the limestone ridge that divided the north of the county, and it had been, in the years before the late Earl's death, a prosperous estate of some 400 acres, and a house large enough to require 12 indoor staff and a head steward with authority over all of them. That authority had been Corvus Oldham's for 22 years. He had served the previous Earl with perfect correctness, and had made himself so necessary to the management of the land that when the title passed to Edmund Ravenswood, the previous Earl's nephew, a man more accustomed to his London rooms and the autumn campaigns in Portugal than to tenant rolls and drainage surveys, Oldham had become not merely steward, but interpreter of the estate itself. Cecily had arrived at Ashvale in the February of the current year, summoned by a brief letter from the Earl's aunt, Lady Ravenswood, who managed the household correspondence in her nephew's frequent absences. The post was for the children of the late younger Mr. Ravenswood, dead of fever these 2 winters. Thomas was 8 years old, and Louisa, who had just turned 6. The children were the Earl's wards, and lived at Ashvale under Nurse Bloom's supervision in the rooms above the west stair. She had taken the post because her own situation left her no alternative. Her father, the Reverend Mr. Marsh of Wiltshire had died the previous spring with a curate's modest living and a set of very thorough account books, and she had come away from the estate of his small effects with £3, a sound education, and a miniature of her mother, painted in the first year of her parents' marriage. She had been, for a few weeks, frightened. Then she had been methodical. Her father had taught her that a clean column of figures was a form of integrity, that the refusal to falsify a number was a moral position, not merely a practical one. She had thought of this on the morning she read Oldham's second ledger. She thought of it again that evening, when she took her own small memorandum book from the drawer of her writing table and opened it to a fresh page. The memorandum book was a narrow thing in tan leather, the kind a clergyman might carry in a coat pocket, and her father had pressed it on her the winter she turned 14 and first showed an aptitude for figures. She had used it to record household accounts at the rectory, then to track the small expenses of her own modest life in the years of her father's illness. Now she opened it to a fresh page and wrote in her small, neat hand the entry she had read. Edmund Ravenswood, Earl of Ashvale, was not an easy man to read. Cecily had formed this opinion within a week of her arrival, and 8 months had not materially altered it. He was 35, she judged, though he looked older when he was tired, which was most of the time she had observed him. He was tall in a way that carried no vanity, broad through the shoulders, and he moved through his own house with the contained economy of a man who had spent years in situations where economy of movement was not aesthetically pleasing, but practically necessary. He was cold, she had decided, not unkind. She had seen him with Thomas and Louisa, brief and serious in the way of a man who had not been taught how to be easy with children, but who was trying, in his own measured way, to learn, and cold in the sense that his attention cost him something, and he gave it precisely and without surplus. He rarely spoke to her beyond the necessary. When he did, the words were direct, and the cadence was level, and she had concluded that he considered her position in the household a practical arrangement, as she did herself. It was therefore with some astonishment that she registered, in the 3rd week of September, the morning he stopped in the doorway of the servants' hall as she was finishing her breakfast. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice carrying across the room with no particular elevation of volume, "you take your meals in the servants' hall." "I do, my lord," she said, and did not add that she found it considerably less uncomfortable than the dining room, where Lady Ravenswood's silences had a weight she could measure. "You are in my household as a gentlewoman," he said. "You will take your meals in the dining room." She looked at him. He returned the look with nothing readable in his face, no invitation or apology or indication that the instruction had cost him any consideration at all. Then he walked away. She sat for a moment with the fact of it. She told herself it was a matter of household administration. She was aware, without quite letting herself be aware, that it was something else. She was aware, for instance, that she had noted with some precision the exact manner in which he had walked away, the set of his shoulders, the unhurried pace of a man who has given an order and does not require its acknowledgement. She was aware that his instruction had produced, in the space of a few seconds, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite its opposite, a complicated warmth she had no vocabulary for and consequently did not name. She had been in service before, to a clergyman's widow in Bath who had never looked at her directly, and she understood that having one's name used and one's position acknowledged was not the same as being seen. She did not confuse the two. She was, however, honest enough to notice the difference. If Lady Ravenswood's opinion of this arrangement was expressed that same afternoon in the small sitting room where she received her callers, Cecily was not present to hear it stated. She had heard the spirit of it, however, in the weeks since her arrival, not directly, but in the tenor of the lady's address. in the slight adjustment of attention that occurred whenever Cecily entered a room the aunt occupied, in the way her ladyship referred to the governess, where another household might have said Miss Marsh or simply Cecily. The season had made its judgment about women in service. They were a species of furniture, well made but utilitarian, not to be confused with the inhabitants of the house. She was, as Lady Ravenswood had observed to Mrs. Aldham in the back drawing-room that same Tuesday, and as Mrs. Aldham had relayed, not maliciously, but thoughtlessly, to Nurse Bloom, who had told Cecily with a bluntness that was itself a form of kindness, a governess and nothing more, and she would do well to remember it. Cecily had thanked Nurse Bloom and returned to the schoolroom. She had spent 20 minutes correcting a map of Asia that Thomas had drawn from memory, and she had found, after those 20 minutes, that her hands were steady. She had done her costly accounting work the following morning, which was a Saturday with no scheduled lessons. A tenant of the Eastern parcel had come to the back office with a payment for the quarter, and Aldham was absent. The head footman had taken the money and made the entry, and when Cecily reviewed the tenant roll she had been keeping in her own memorandum book, she had begun the practice simply because she found the figures of the estate interesting, and not because she imagined anyone would ask her about them, and she saw that the entry differed from the tenant's stated payment by 14 shillings. She had walked to the back office, found the correct entry in the primary ledger, and corrected the footman's arithmetic. Then she had gone to the tenant at the gate and told him quietly that his receipt, when Aldham prepared it, should reflect the full amount, and that if it did not, he should come to her directly. The tenant, a man of 60 with a gray beard, and the particular careful stillness of someone who had been managing small sums against consequential men for his whole working life, had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "Yes, miss," and touched his hat, and walked back to his cart with a fraction more ease in his step than he had arrived with. She had not told anyone about this. There was no one to tell. She filed the correction in her memorandum book and said nothing. And she thought of her father, who had said that integrity was not a performance, but a practice, and that one performed it whether or not anyone was watching. Someone had been watching. She had been, in the habitual early hours before lessons for most of the previous week, sitting with the estate's primary accounts in the small room off the library where Aldham kept the current year's ledgers. No one had asked her to do this. She had told herself she was simply exercising the habit her father had given her, keeping her mind in practice, familiarizing herself with the estate she had come to serve. None of this was untrue. It was also not the complete truth. The complete truth was that the secondary ledger had been troubling her sleep, and she had found that the only reliable cure for troubled sleep was more numbers, more precision, more of the cold, clear light of a well-kept column. By the 5th morning she had confirmed 6 discrepancies. By the 7th she had 23. The night of the 3rd day of Michaelmas accounting, when the house had settled into its late quiet, and the nursery was dark and most of the household was in bed, Cecily sat at her writing table with 3 candles lit, and Aldham's discrepancies laid out across 5 pages of her memorandum book in a double-column comparison, recording what the primary ledger showed, what the secondary ledger recorded, and the difference between them. It was painstaking work. It was also, she understood as she worked, the work she was most fitted for. Her father's careful training, the years of rectory accounts, the 8 months of watching Ashvale's finances with the trained eye she had not been asked to bring, but could not leave behind. All of it resolved into this: a clear column, a clean number, an irrefutable gap. She was on her 4th page when she heard the sound from across the corridor. A child's voice, low and frightened, the particular register of a nightmare's aftermath. Louisa. Cecily set down her pen. She looked for a moment at the open pages, at the figures she had accumulated. Then she closed the memorandum book and crossed the corridor. She did not know the Earl was standing in the doorway of the nursery passage. She did not know he had risen, as he sometimes did in the small hours, to walk the house in the way of a man who could not quiet his thoughts enough to remain horizontal. That he had heard his ward's cry from the corridor above and come up the east stair. That he had arrived at the nursery door and found it already open, the governess already inside. He stood at the threshold and did not make himself known. Cecily sat on the edge of Louisa's cot and took the child into her arms. And she spoke to her in a voice so low that only the child could catch the words. Something about the house, about walls and solidity, about the fact that daylight was coming, and that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Louisa pressed her face into the gray wool of Cecily's shoulder, and her breathing slowed by degrees, and the governess held her without impatience, without hurry, without any indication that she had left 3 candles burning and 4 pages of figures incomplete in the room behind her. What she did not know was that the man in the doorway had stood at his younger brother's bedside 2 years before, in a room very like this one, and had made a promise he had believed, for every month of those 2 years, that he was failing. That he had sat awake at midnight in the library with the primary estate ledger, and looked at figures that showed the estate declining, and had concluded it was his own incompetence. That he had told himself, in the particular low voice that one reserves for self-indictments, that his brother had trusted the wrong man. He had not known, until that moment, which man he had meant. He stood in the doorway of the nursery and watched the governess hold his ward, and something in his chest that had been held at a controlled tension for most of 2 years shifted slightly on its moorings. It was not sentiment. Or rather, it was not only sentiment. What he recognized, watching her, was competence in a form he had not accounted for. He had employed a governess for the children because they required one, and he had examined her references with the thoroughness he applied to everything, and he had concluded she was adequate. He had not expected to find her at 2 a.m. with 3 candles lit, and the estate ledgers open beside her father's little account book, annotating discrepancies he had paid a man for 22 years not to notice. He had not expected to find her setting that work aside without a word of resentment to hold a child who was frightened. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not examine what he felt. He was not, as a general rule, a man who examined what he felt at the hour of 2 a.m. in a doorway, with the whole cold November house around him, and 2 years of private conviction about his own failure sitting in his chest, like a stone he had grown accustomed to carrying. He walked back down the east stair in silence and sat in the library until the candles burned low. If you have ever watched a careful person be told that they imagine things, you will understand what happened to Cecily in the library on the morning of the 4th day. It was not a loud scene. That was what she had not expected. Aldum arrived first, composed in his dark coat, the careful correctness of his address unchanged. He had been informed, he told the Earl, that Miss Marsh had been looking through the estate accounts. He wished only to make the Earl aware that the estate accounts were a matter of professional sensitivity, that the governess had no training in the management of agricultural property, and that the discrepancies she imagined she had found in the records were the result of a system of entry that required, as he was happy to explain to her, a knowledge of the estate's history she had not had the time to acquire. He said all of this pleasantly, and with the confidence of a man who had spent 22 years being believed. Lady Ravenswood, who had entered the library behind him, said that she had never understood why a governess should find it necessary to concern herself with anything outside the schoolroom. She said this without heat, in the tone of a woman describing a natural law. The solicitor, Mr. Pennock, who had come for the quarter-day settlement and found himself inadvertently in the middle of something, said that he had been told the governess had raised a concern about the accounts, and that Eldom had described the concern as a misreading by someone without the necessary context to evaluate what she had seen. He said this neutrally, as a man reporting a message, but the words, in their precision, were a governess and nothing more, arrived at through a different door. He had the look of a man who did not necessarily believe what he had just said, but considered it outside his professional scope to say so. Cecily stood near the back of the library and said nothing. She had not been invited to speak, and in any case there was nothing to say that the memorandum book had not already said more precisely than she could have managed with her voice. She was aware of Lady Ravenswood's eyes on her, that particular attention the lady gave her at moments when Cecily's existence created a complication. She was aware of Aldom's composure, which was the composure of a man who has spent 22 years being comfortable with his own decisions. She was aware that the Earl had not looked at her once since she had entered the room. The Earl stood at the window. He did not look at Cecily. He said, in his level voice, that Miss Marsh was to confine herself to the schoolroom. He said that the estate accounts were Mr. Aldom's responsibility, had been so for 22 years, and that he had no reason to doubt the competence of a man who had served his family since before his own majority. He said this without cruelty, which was almost worse than cruelty. Then he asked her to leave. She left. She walked out of the library and closed the door behind her, and stood for a moment in the corridor with her hand still on the handle, listening to the house. From above came the distant sound of Thomas's Latin, recited in the repetitive patient cadence of a child who has been given a task and will not be hurried. The corridor smelled of beeswax and coal smoke and the faint must of the library's old paper. She had been in this corridor every day for 8 months. She knew every board that creaked. She went upstairs. She stood in the corridor outside the schoolroom and listened to the children inside, Thomas reading aloud to Louisa in the patient cadence of an older child performing an act of kindness. The same act, she thought, that the Earl performed when he came to the nursery at midnight, uncertain and trying. The wrong man in his own house by his own judgment. She stood there until her breathing was entirely even. Then she went to her own room and sat at her writing table. She could leave in the morning. There was nothing preventing her. She had done the work. She had been disbelieved. Disbelief by a man who had not looked at her was not the same as the numbers being wrong, and she was sufficiently her father's daughter to understand that the difference was permanent. She lit the 3 candles. She opened the memorandum book to the last completed page. She continued. She worked until 5 in the morning. The first light was coming over the ridge when she finished the 5th page. 47 entries, cross-referenced against the primary ledger, the secondary ledger, and her own 8-month record of the estate's material state. She wrote the total at the bottom of the column in a clean, clear hand, £2,114, over 4 years, an average of £528 per annum, drawn from the estate in payments to suppliers who had never supplied, tradesmen who had never worked, accounts payable entries in the secondary ledger that disappeared from the primary ledger by morning. She closed the memorandum book. She looked at it for a moment. The tan leather of her father's gift, its pages now nearly full. She went to the library. She placed the memorandum book on the reading table with the most recent pages open, weighted by the estate's primary ledger, which she had located on the shelf above the writing cabinet. She returned to her room. She took out her traveling case and began, with the same quietness she applied to everything, to pack. She was folding her second gown when she heard, below, the sound of a man's step on the library floor. Mr. Pennock, the solicitor, had arrived early for the quarter-day settlement and had gone to the library to review his notes. He found the memorandum book on the reading table and, being a methodical man himself, read it. He read it twice. He set it down and sat for a while. He sent a note to the Earl. The scene that followed in the library contained 5 people. The Earl, Mr. Pennock, Aldham, Nurse Bloom, who had come from the nursery passage and stood at the back of the room with her arms folded, and the senior tenant from the eastern parcel, one Harrow, who had been summoned for the settlement and had not yet been told why his presence had become suddenly necessary. There was also, eventually, Cecily Marsh, who had come downstairs with her traveling case in the hall and had been met in the passage by Nurse Bloom's hand on her wrist and the old woman's low instruction to come with her. Cecily had left the case in the hall. She stood near the library door and watched the Earl read the memorandum book. He read it slowly, with the particular stillness of a man for whom the act of reading has become the act of comprehension, and the two are not finished until the body has had a moment to absorb what the mind has understood. The solicitor stood at the window. Aldham stood near the fireplace with his arms at his sides, and as the Earl turned page after page, the composure of 22 years of confident service began, very quietly, to come undone. Harrow, the tenant, had begun to speak when the Earl looked up from the page showing the building materials entry. Harrow described 3 separate payments for repairs to the east drainage, work he had watched Aldham oversee on site with his own eyes, materials delivered to the gate, that appeared in neither ledger. He said he had brought his receipts each time as required and had never been given a corresponding entry in the estate records. He said he had not known where to go with the discrepancy. He said the governess had told him to come to her directly if his receipt was wrong. Aldham said nothing. Lady Ravenswood, who had not been present at the start and came in through the side door midway through this account, looked at Cecily and then away. The particular confidence with which she held her opinions had not disappeared, but it had been, briefly, reseated in a quieter part of her expression. The Earl closed the memorandum book. He stood at the reading table with one hand flat on its cover. Mr. Pennock said that the entries, as documented, represented a systematic diversion of estate funds that would require a full accounting and the engagement of a magistrate to determine the appropriate course. He said this in the neutral voice of a man delivering a professional judgment. Aldham said, for the first time, that Miss Marsh had had access to documents she should not have had, and that her conclusions were those of a woman with no formal training in estate management. The Earl crossed the room. He crossed it in 3 strides, and the room's attention followed him, and he stopped in front of Cecily and looked at her. She had her hands at her waist, not folded in the composed posture she had maintained for 8 months, but simply at her sides, her fingers still. She was tired. She had not slept. She had packed a case and set it in the hall, and come into this room not knowing what she would find. And now the room's entire attention was on her, and she was simply standing in it, her gray-green eyes level, and her face the face of a woman who had done the work she was capable of doing and was prepared to accept whatever verdict the room returned. She was not braced. She was finished. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice carrying the room the way it always carried the room, without effort and without elevation. He said the words plainly, the way a man says the only thing that matters. "Miss Marsh's word is the only account I trust." The library was quiet. She was aware of Nurse Bloom's presence at the edge of the room, of Harrow's careful stillness near the window, of Mr. Pennock beginning to gather his papers with the discretion of a man who understands that what comes next is not his business. She was aware, in the way she was always aware of such things before she had trained herself not to be, of exactly where the Earl was standing and how the winter light from the long library windows fell across the side of his face, turning the dark slate of his eyes a shade lighter. Nurse Bloom made a small sound from the back of the room. Mr. Pennock looked at his notes. Harrow looked at his boots. Lady Ravenswood looked at her nephew for a moment, and something in her expression that was not quite softness but was adjacent to it arrived and settled there, as though she had been waiting for a verdict and had received one and found it. On reflection, more than she could argue with, Oldham left the library. The solicitor followed him. The subsequent proceedings were Mr. Pennock's affair and the magistrate's, and Cecily was not required to be present for them. The Earl picked up the memorandum book and held it out to her. She took it. Their hands did not touch. She was aware, in the exact way she had learned not to examine too closely, of the precise distance between his hand and hers, of the way the library's winter light fell across the side of his face, of the faint alteration in his breathing that she had been cataloguing, without intending to, for 8 months. His expression had the quality it sometimes had when he was with the children, not ease but the effort toward ease of a man who understood its value and was learning the mechanics. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing, my lord," she said. The figures owed it to themselves. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was the structure a smile would inhabit if he allowed it room. He said after a moment, "I should like you to stay at Asheville, if you are willing." He said this in the level register he used for everything, but there was a quality in it that was not administrative. Thomas has begun to improve his Latin. Louisa has stopped having nightmares most nights. The estate requires a set of eyes that are not persuaded by a suit of clothes and 22 years of confident answers. She looked at him. He returned the look with the first thing she had seen in his face, that he had not calculated first. "And I," he said, his voice dropping a register, to the kind of quiet that was not meant to carry the room, "find that I am a great deal less willing to see you leave than I had persuaded myself I was." She did not answer immediately. She was aware of her own pulse. She was aware of the rain beginning on the library windows, the sound of Thomas's voice from somewhere above them in the house, reading aloud. She was aware of the memorandum book in her hands, her father's gift, nearly full now, the last pages occupied by the account that had just closed. "I am willing," she said. The words were simple, and she meant them with everything she had. He held her hands for a moment longer, the both of them standing in the quiet of the library with the fire settling behind them, and the November rain still at the windows, and the memorandum book on the shelf above the writing cabinet, waiting. She could feel the warmth of his hands through her own, the steadiness of a man who had made a decision and was not going to reconsider it. She had not expected this. She had not, if she was honest, expected anything beyond continued employment and the careful management of a professional regard that was not quite what it appeared to be. She had spent the previous 8 months becoming an expert in what was not quite what it appeared to be. His expression, when he said her name, was not what she had seen in the library when he read the memorandum book, not the controlled, furious precision of a man who has discovered a theft of £2,000 committed against his dead brother's inheritance. It was something quieter and more final. It was the expression of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for, and intends to say so plainly. She had said yes in the same register he had used, plain and without condition, because it was the only honest thing to say. The months that followed were quiet in the way that the best things in Cecily's experience were quiet. Not empty, but fully inhabited. Mr. Pennock's investigation produced a full accounting and a repayment demand served to Oldham before the year was out. The county's attention was on the matter for the first several weeks, the way a county's attention always fell on the visible humiliation of a man who had been trusted and had decided that trust was a resource to be spent. There were some who said the governess had made trouble. There were more who said she had been right. Lady Ravenswood, in a conversation that Cecily was not present to hear, but whose substance reached her through Nurse Bloom's particular directness, told her nephew that the governess had shown more practical intelligence in 8 months than Oldham had shown in 22 years, and that this was a thing worth considering when one thought about the future management of the estate. She said this as though it were her own conclusion arrived at independently. Edmund received it with the particular expression of a man who has already reached the same conclusion by a different path. The estate's actual finances, cleared of 4 years of systematic theft, proved considerably more sound than Edmund had believed, and the particular grief he had carried, the conviction that he had failed his brother's children, failed his brother's trust, failed the estate in some essential way that only he could not see, was over those months slowly remade into something he could carry differently. He did not speak to her of his brother again after that first oblique disclosure in the nursery passage. She did not need him to. She had read the evidence, the portrait in the library that he never moved but sometimes looked at, the way he spoke of the boy's father to Thomas as a fixed point, the 3 months of each year that still sat in his expression as their own season of low grief. She found that she could be present in it with him without requiring him to explain it. That was, she thought, the kind of understanding that came not from being told a thing, but from watching it carefully for long enough. He proposed to her on the first morning of November, in the library. He came to the doorway and stood there a moment before entering, as though he wanted to ensure that she was present, and that the room contained only the 2 of them. Thomas and Louisa were in the nursery with Nurse Bloom. The fire was lit. Her father's memorandum book stood on the shelf above the writing cabinet, where she had placed it in October without quite deciding to, only understanding, after the fact, that it belonged there. The room was quiet, in the way the library was always quiet, the particular absorbed silence of a room whose walls are lined with accumulated thought. She had come to love this quality in the weeks since she had been given free use of the shelves, had come to understand it as a kind of company, the presence of all those careful minds in their covers, waiting. He did not perform the proposal. He said what was true in the precise way he said everything, and she said yes in the same register, and he took both her hands and held them for a moment, and said her name, Cecily, for the first time, in his voice, as a thing claimed rather than a form of address, and the warmth of that single syllable settled into her chest, and stayed. The announcement was made in the drawing-room that same afternoon. Lady Ravenswood received it with a silence of some duration, and then said in a voice that had had its confidence reset into a quieter key that the children would benefit from a settled household. She said this as though it were only a practical observation. It was also, Cecily understood, the lady's version of an apology, and she received it in the spirit it was given. That evening Cecily sat in the library with Thomas and Louisa, a fire lit in the grate against the November cold. Thomas was reading from a natural history he had found in the top shelf, holding the book at the angle of someone who has recently discovered that the world contains more information than he had previously been given credit for. Louisa sat pressed against Cecily's side with her own small book, which she was not reading so much as using as an anchor while she watched the fire. Edmund appeared in the doorway. He had taken to appearing in doorways in the past 2 months, she had noticed, as though he was practicing the act of arrival, learning to enter rooms rather than to move through them, as a man moves through territory he has surveyed and resolved. She had said nothing about this observation. She filed it alongside the others. He had begun asking Thomas to show him things in books, rather than simply directing the boy's reading, that he had sat with Louisa one afternoon while she drew, saying nothing, just sitting there with his long legs extended and his dark coat open, present, that he had walked with Cecily on the estate grounds 3 times since October, and each time had pointed out something on the land, a field boundary, a stone wall, a stand of hawthorn he said his brother had planted, with the careful deliberateness of a man introducing 2 people he wanted to know each other. He looked at his wards, who did not look up. Thomas absorbed. Louisa at the edge of sleep. He looked at Cecily, who looked back at him with the full, steady attention she had learned to stop rationing. Something in his face was quieter than it had been for as long as she had known it. He crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that his arm was at her shoulder. And for a few minutes none of them said anything at all, and the fire settled, and Thomas turned a page. On the shelf above the writing cabinet, her father's memorandum book stood between the estate's primary accounts and the new ledger Mr. Pennock had prepared for the new year. Its pages were full. There was nothing more it needed to hold. It stood in its place, as her father had always said a clean set of figures stood, not as a monument, but as a record. The work had been done. The account was settled. Outside the library windows, the first snow of November was beginning to fall, soft and unhurried, over the ridge and the stone walls and the 400 acres of Ashvale, which was, at last, exactly what it had always been. Sound